Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. College football week 0 in the books. College football week 1, we've seen almost every FBS program. Ball State's still on a bye, and we'll get a better indication of who these teams are going forward with some very useful data points this week. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. And Brad, I'm coming to you first on this. You've been staring at the week 0, week 1 board for 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 months in some cases. How refreshing is it for you to get a fresh look at some new numbers out there and see how the market overreacts or in some cases underreacts to that first data point?
Yeah, I mean, I woke up on Sunday morning feeling a lot more energized. New data to interpret, new lines, new games to analyze. The season starts now. For most teams, it also starts now because 80% of college football just played Little Sisters of the Poor last week. So I'm excited for week 2. We can start to get an idea of who is who and who is not.
There's no doubt about it. Although you look at some schedules, some teams may not actually have their schedule kick into high gear until the middle of October. But plenty of great games on the horizon. And Payne, you got any takeaways from what you saw week 1, or ready to dive right into the 5 marquee matchups we have poised to deliver for our listeners this week?
I was texting Brad as his beloved Irish were playing, and he claims he wasn't watching, and we'll take him at his word. He's trustworthy. But I was texting him, and it was basically going into the clouds. But what I was saying was the offensive line was surprisingly good, and that was something we highlighted last week. 6 career starts, none of them together, and you're going into a hostile Kyle Field. I thought the Irish front did more than stalemate A&M's defensive line, and that group is going to be damn good heading into 2025. And then I think another blue blood that we specifically were interested in seeing play was Penn State, and the cohesion between new offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki and Drew Allar. And could Andy get Drew to be more aggressive and use the arm cannon downfield? And sure as shit, Drew Allar, average depth of target, 13.2 yards. 59% of his throws went 10-plus yards. So 2 key things we covered last week and outlined as factors to look for ended up playing what I thought was huge parts of both those teams' wins.
Penn State fans have been fooled before. They know that James Franklin will put the governor on him once they get into the heart of conference play, and we'll be back to an average depth of target behind the line of scrimmage. But you're right. I mean, that Penn State offense looked dynamic. We talked about West Virginia taking money in that game. Penn State looked to be the dominant side, and you saw a lot of line moves kind of go a different direction from where they were, but that's why they play the games. And lo and behold, some interesting contests this week, and no better place to start than with the defending national champions who welcome in the Texas Longhorns. It's all about Michigan and Texas. Big noon kickoff. We're looking at Texas, a now 7.5-point road favorite for their trip to Michigan. Total on this game has been leaking down. We've seen it take multiple ways, from a peak as high as 48 in some places, 45.5 more or less the consensus, now sitting at 42. A second meeting in series history between these proud programs. Vince Young was the quarterback the only other time these teams played one another. Michigan, most wins in college football history with 1,005 on the program resume. Texas tied for 4th with 945. Payne, I'm not sure how this impacts the handicap, knowing that Derek Jeter will be the honorary captain for Michigan. That's got to be worth at least a field goal when you're adjusting some of your power numbers. As far as market movement in this game is concerned, Texas was kind of...
Royce is loving that. Royce is definitely factoring that into the number right now as he listens.
There's no doubt, although he would have been flying high with Western Michigan if they were able to upset Wisconsin. I'm not sure how he'll feel this week about them matched up against Ohio State. Spoiler alert, a game we will not cover on the podcast. When we look at Texas, they were a 3.5 point favorite for most of the summer in some of the look-ahead markets. We've, of course, seen the market respond. It's only Michigan's 5th time as an underdog since the end of the 2020 season. Michigan, of course, comes in riding high with that massive winning streak. You have to go back to their college football playoff loss against TCU 2 seasons ago to find the last time the Wolverines ended up on the wrong side of the ledger. We look at Texas, one of the 2 programs in the country, along with Utah, that returned their head coach, both coordinators, strength and conditioning coach, and starting quarterback this season. Although if you watch that game against Colorado State, we'll see who Texas's starting quarterback is to finish the season, but maybe a different discussion for a different day. When we look at Michigan, they're going to need to do a little bit more on the offensive side than what they showed against Fresno State, rotating in a tandem of quarterbacks, neither that looked equipped for Big Ten football, but you do wonder how vanilla that offense was. Brad, Texas on the scoreboard, dominant performance against Colorado State, 52-0 in that game. It was a battle leading up to kickoff. We saw a very influential betting group take the prices north to 5 touchdowns, drive that all the way down to 31, but that number got run all the way back to 35, and Texas was able to completely stymie them. Quinn Ewers had his coming out party in Tuscaloosa last year in a game of this magnitude, but a little bit different with a target on his back. We know about Texas and their backfield, a little bit banged up, wide receivers that Michigan just won't see, but this is a Michigan defense that a lot of the pundits in and around that program say could be better by year's end than what we saw with the national championship team. If we're going to see that, it's got to be on full display Saturday with that noon Eastern kickoff.
Yeah, so I didn't watch either one of these 2 teams live on Saturday. And obviously, you look at, you're just like anybody else, you look at the finals, then you dive into the box score a little bit. And, I anticipated, before I watched the 2 games to think, oh, wow, I missed a little low. Maybe I should upgrade Texas a little bit, and maybe I should, downgrade Michigan significantly. But after rewatching the games, I did not have those similar thoughts. I'll start on the Texas side of the ball and their offense. I would say it was good. It wasn't great. And some of the more advanced stats say that. Success rate was 25th. EPA was 16th. Again, good, not great. I'd say the same thing for Quinn Ewers. Solid game, but obviously playing, weak Colorado State defense. And look, this is the media take, but you can't avoid it. Arch came into the stadium. Not only was there a different energy in the stadium, but there was a different energy on the field. He just had more pop coming in. So I agree with you. I think at some point we could see Arch this year if Ewers struggles in a game or 2. A couple questions I had about Texas offensively, certainly at the skill position. I thought there was big questions about the new receiving room because it was entirely new from where it was last year. That was one position group that I actually came away impressed with. I like the true freshman 5-star Ryan Wingo. He was the highest graded true freshman wide receiver in the country last week. Isaiah Bond flashed, the Alabama transfer. Jonte Cook made a couple plays. The thing that worried me, though, a little bit was, boy, the run game wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't dominant. Obviously, they're replacing a starter in Jonathan Brooks. They lost a projected starter in C.J. Baxter to injury, and I didn't see that alpha or anywhere near close to it in that running back room. And the offensive line, to me, got decent push, but you would expect that against Colorado State. I don't expect decent push this week because safe to say, Michigan was pretty dominant. That defense didn't look much different than what we saw last year because they held Fresno to 9 yards rushing. You look at the success rate nationally for last week's games, number two in defensive EPA. They didn't really show a lot of weakness. Number 5 in EPA rush, number 1 in EPA dropback. You look at individual performances, the defensive line flashed big time, including Josiah Stewart had a couple sacks. He had a 50% pass rush win rate. Derek Moore also graded out really well on his 37 snaps. Obviously, I haven't even talked about the 2 interior guys in Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham. Barham, the Maryland transfer, was all over the field. Obviously, Will Johnson in the back end is an All-American, had a nice pick 6 there. I think Michigan wins the battle up front. I'll give the edge to Michigan's defensive front 7. I think that the main battle here and ultimately who wins this matchup between the Texas offense and the Michigan defense comes down to the two maybe question marks for both units. The Texas wide receiver room is going to have to gel and grow up quickly. Same could be said about the Michigan defensive backs outside of Will Johnson. So that one I think is a little bit more of a question mark. But the overall arching thing for me is I'm going to give the slight edge to Michigan here just because I am most confident in their front seven of any of the units.
The interesting part watching that Michigan-Fresno State game, to your point, Brad, Michigan able to disrupt a lot of what Fresno wanted to do, of course, getting into the backfield, stymieing their ground game. But it also appeared that Mikey Keene had to make a lot of the plays running for his life, using his mobility, something that Quinn Ewers probably wouldn't say is his number one strength. And we've seen Ewers, when the pocket gets muddy around him, we hit the rewind button. I know he's a different quarterback now to a couple years ago against TCU, and they brought pressure from all different angles. Ewers never looked comfortable, and we know that the Horned Frogs were able to win that game, as roughly a touchdown underdog, much like Michigan is in this spot. Now, Payne, when we go to the other side of the ball and we look at Michigan's offense, I'm not sure any Michigan fan wants to talk about what they showed offensively in their season opener against Fresno. They were rotating in both quarterbacks. Davis Warren wins the job, and I put that in quotation marks because it looked more like Alex Orji lost it. Donovan Edwards seems to be a running back that wants to hit a home run every time he gets the ball in his hands rather than picking up 5 or 6 yards. But we knew this Michigan offensive line was going to be a work in progress. A lot of inexperience there. On the flip side, Texas doesn't have a Tavondre Sweat. They don't have a Byron Murphy to anchor that defensive line. So even if the secondary trends up, and I think we all agreed when we broke this team down in the SEC preview that they would, there are still some questions, but it begs the bigger overarching sentiment. Does Michigan have any caliber wide receivers that can put these Texas defensive backs in a position of peril or conflict? Because it was all Colson Loveland if Michigan wanted to do anything in the air last week in the opener.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest question. We all watched that game, and we anticipated coming into the season this would be a bit of a question mark, and then we watch it unfold, and we kind of believe our thoughts coming into the year. And for me, Davis Warren was just... It's tough, right? I think you pointed it out. He was basically the toughest Smurf in the room. And he doesn't have a ton of help either. I mean, aside from Colston Loveland, the other playmakers don't really show an ability to separate, and none of them have juice downfield. If you look at that game specifically against Fresno, all the other pass catchers not named Loveland averaged 0.37 yards per route run, 3 drops. Davis Warren dropped back 26 times, completed 1 pass further than 9 yards. 76% of Warren's attempts were behind the line of scrimmage or within 9 yards. And so, even when you factor in the depth of target, I didn't think Davis Warren was overly accurate, and it wasn't like he was under pressure either, which is concerning. 26% pressure rate. Fresno's front only created a 6% havoc rate in that game. So he was really comfortable, all things considered. And so, if you have a below-average quarterback and a receiver group that can't separate, and they don't really scare you deep, it kind of becomes a phone booth offense. And I think defenses will neutralize the offensive line with just what we talk about all the time. It's a simple math equation, 8 versus 5, 9 versus 5, 9 versus 6. And on top of that, you got Michigan replacing an entire starting O-line from last season. And I think we just saw exactly that, right? Michigan's offensive line performed below expectation. Based upon what I was expecting. Mullings and Edwards averaged 1.4 yards per rush before first contact. Some of it, to your point, though, Todd, is Edwards' vision isn't always the greatest, and I think we were all a little surprised with his performance in the national title game. One of them was basically just the one long touchdown run was a game of pinball. He missed the hole and kind of bounced out and got fortunate there. But Edwards leaves a lot to be desired with vision, but I would have expected a little bit higher of an offensive line performance based upon, Fresno's defensive projections, which is basically an above-average Mountain West front seven. Michigan had a negative EPA per rush in the first half. The lone touchdown drive was only 31 yards. It came off that short field turnover. And, I think at this point there really isn't another option other than Davis Warren. If you listen to Sharon Moore, it's pretty vague after the Fresno game, but it sounds like Tuttle isn't really throwing all that much right now, and he was the number one quarterback. Orji is who we thought he was, right? He's a running back pretending to be a quarterback. And
hey, Devin Gardner did just fine doing that exact same thing as Alex Orji back in the day.
Those two are not on the same level of athleticism.
No, I would agree. Watching Orji try and bounce the ball outside and get dragged down by defensive ends.
It's a little different in speed, and that was kind of a time when passing wasn't completely thought about for a lot of offenses. But based upon expectation coming into the season. And then also some of, the respected money you mentioned, there was a lot of that week one on Colorado State. I thought relative to that, Texas exceeded expectation defensively. Now, just watching the film, there were multiple times where the interior of the Longhorns defense was pushed back by Colorado State. And we know that was a question coming into the season. They were trying to improve it in the portal. They added the kid from Louisville there. But if you look, Justin Marshall, Colorado State's running back, averaged 2.2 yards per rush before first contact last week. In the second quarter, before reaching garbage time, CSU had a 46% success rate on standard downs. But Texas knows, if you listen to some of their players, what kind of game they're in store for here. Barron Sorrell did an interview on Monday, came out and said, hey, Michigan's run first. That excites me and everybody on our defense. If you're going to test our physicality, then we're looking forward to showing what we can do. So I think Texas understands defensively what they're in for up front. We heard the Longhorn secondary had improved in fall camp. We saw that game one. Torrey Horton held to 31 yards on 6 targets. If Michigan can't threaten through the air, and the Longhorn secondary wins one-on-one, that's going to allow Pete Kwiatkowski to put more guys in the middle of the field to stop Michigan's rushing attack. And that's really, the path to points for Michigan is being able to establish a ground game. And I don't know if they're going to be able to do it, even though what I saw from Texas on the inside leave much to be desired despite the scoreboard.
Final question. I'll come back to you, Brad. When you look at a game like this, and I think it's always helpful for a lot of the new bettors who are betting college football for the first time, who may have just found Bet the Board this summer and not been with us since inception. When you see the market respond the way it did to a data point that I don't know either of us take a ton away from, Texas's dismantling of Colorado State to the tune of 52-0, and Michigan flirting with a cover, albeit needing a defensive touchdown to even get close as a 3-touchdown favorite. Yet here's the market going from 3.5, 4, past the key number of 7, out to 7.5. Is there an overarching sentiment, maybe not necessarily for this game, because there is another game where we see a big line move off of one data point as well that we'll get to later in the show, that you can share with our listeners to make them smarter and thinking about this in a more broad context as handicappers?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, and I don't know if I have a definitive answer because, we are certainly living in a new era of college football where the rosters are, instead of 25%, overhaul, in some instances 50% or even more overhaul. So I usually tend to take I'm not very aggressive with power ratings because I trust my preseason numbers because that's all I do for literally 8-9 months is dive into teams. So I don't like overreacting to week one. But in today's day and age, sometimes you just have to look no further. I didn't want to bring them up too much, but Florida State. That's a team, the roster overhaul that. But certainly none of us expected what we've seen from them. So you got to get a little more aggressive in regards to a few teams. But I'm glad you brought it up. This was traded. It wasn't a very liquid market, but you could bet this game in any sports book this summer, all summer. And Texas was 3.5, 4, or in 3 in some cases. And now it's 7.5. To me, it screams a little bit of an overreaction in the market.
And that's fair. And that's kind of what I wanted to get your takeaway on, knowing that, look, to your point, not only during the summer, up until, 4 days ago or 5 days ago, you could have had a chance to lay a shorter price on Texas. Here we are now with a number that's ballooned out. And, of course, Michigan playing at home. We'll see how Sharon Moore fares in his first truly big test, not as an interim head coach, but as a full-time head coach against a Texas team that would love nothing more than to try and get that resume-defining win in the non-conference portion of the schedule early on in the campaign. Well, that may be a defensive showdown when you look at a total between Texas and Michigan. This is the lowest total on the board. And, Brad, we had to bend some rules to get Payne, who's contractually obligated not to talk about Iowa most weeks on this podcast, to break this game down. But here we are with Iowa State headed to Iowa City to take on the Hawkeyes. And you're looking at Iowa right now. We'll call them a 2.5-point consensus favorite across the board. Total in this game sits at 35 more or less. There are some 35.5s. There are some 34.5s out there. 71st meeting in series history. Iowa leads 47-23. Credit to these two programs. This game means a ton in Iowa, and as a result, the game has never been played outside of Iowa City or Ames. Iowa's now won 7 of the last 8 meetings and led 20-3 going into the fourth quarter last season. Held Iowa State to just 3.9 yards per play, their fewest in any game for the Cyclones since 2018. When you look at Matt Campbell's resume, just 1-6 versus Iowa, despite being 15-8 versus all other non-conference opponents, versus Iowa minus 9.6 points per game compared to a 10.8 points per game advantage against other foes. And this is an Iowa State team who didn't know exactly what their quarterback situation was going to look like last year going into the game, sorted it out as the season progressed, and you wonder if that's something that they can hang their hat on. Totals players out there, the under in the last 19 meetings between these programs, 17-2 under the total, including 5 straight unders.
Wow.
With those 19 meetings averaging a grand total of 38.7 points per game. Last year's total, though, at 34.5 was the low water mark, with the previous low being 39 over the last 10 meetings. So keep that in mind when you look at some of the historicals, trying to place all of this in context. And Brad, when we look at Iowa State offensively, Taylor Mauser has been with Matt Campbell for a while, 9th season on the ISU staff, but his first season as offensive coordinator. They keep talking about Rocco Becht, his experience, a willingness to stretch the field, and there are a couple of difference makers for Iowa State, not only in their backfield, you wouldn't know it by Abu Sama only carrying the ball 5 times in their opener against North Dakota, but Jaden Higgins, Jalen Noel, matched up against an Iowa defense who picked up right where they left off in their season opener against Illinois State, continuing to be one of the stingiest stop units in the entire country.
Yeah, Iowa State offensively wasn't an overwhelmingly great look for the new coordinator. I don't know if they're playing possum with Sama, with them only getting 5 carries. Obviously, we saw him explode at the end of last season, particularly the Kansas State game, but that rush offense was not good by any stretch against a North Dakota team that is still a good FCS team, but I'm a little down on North Dakota this year as far as the power rating. So I was a little bit stunned that after a first drive where Iowa State boom bang, couple big pass plays, went right down the field and scored. That was not that wouldn't give me a lot of confidence, especially against this Iowa defense. But I mean, in particular, you look at the offense success rate, 107 EPA. 41, a little bit better there, but the rush success rate, how about number 130 last week? I mean, when you can't get pushed against North Dakota's defensive front, I don't think you're getting it against Iowa. You mentioned Rocco Becht. Yep, obviously last year came on the scene. You know, was thrusted in the quarterback role because of the off-field issues for what was going to be the starting quarterback. I mean, again, he looks functional. 10.3 yards per attempt. The completion percentage was there, took care of the football. You mentioned the 2 wideouts who I'm really high on that really graded out well last week, Higgins and Noel. So pass game's there, but to me the worry would be is if you can't run the football and you become one-dimensional against Iowa and you got to throw on most downs, that's where Iowa likes to turn you over. And you mentioned, Iowa, winning 7 of the last 8 matches. So a big reason why is they have not had a negative turnover margin against Iowa State since 2014. So that would be a big time concern here. If Iowa State cannot at least be functional in the ground game, not asking them to go for 200 yards, but they got to have at least a semblance of an attack. Otherwise, Iowa, I think, will tee off on them. And you mentioned Iowa's defense. I mean, there isn't much to say. They are as expected. Shutout. Less than 200 yards, 1.7 yards per carry, defensive EPA number 11 last week, success rate number 7, early downs EPA number 2, forced 3 turnovers. They got 2 really productive players at linebacker, which Iowa State does, and Payne will get to that in a second. Then Higgins and Jackson. I like this Graves kid who was highly regarded coming out of high school a couple years ago. He had 3 sacks. I mean, this is pretty obvious, and the reason why the total is 35 is you got to give the big edge to Iowa's defense here.
It makes a ton of sense. And look, credit to Iowa Hawkeyes fans. They lived through the first half last week at Kinnick Stadium against Illinois State, and I'm sure they had their head in hands going, this is more of the same, even with new offensive coordinator. Lo and behold, Tim Lester unleashed fury in the second half. Not a coincidence that Kirk Ferentz was suspended for the game. And Iowa went nuclear, at least by Iowa standards, Payne. Last year, this was a team that averaged the fewest points per game for a 10-win team since 1976. Only the service academies averaged less passing yards per game. And their 94 punts was 14 more than Navy for best or worst in the country in that particular department. But Cade McNamara, after a slow start, got things going, finished the game 21 of 31 for 251 yards, 3 touchdown passes, 13 of 14 after the break, 177 of those yards coming there with a 3 touchdown to no interception ratio. You started to see weapons, and again, I use this term relatively speaking for Iowa Hawkeyes football. Reese Vanderzee gets things going, becoming the first Iowa player with multiple receiving touchdowns in a game since 2020 when Amir Smith-Marset was able to accomplish that. Luke Lachey returned. They had a tandem of backs. The offensive line looked somewhat capable, but in steps an Iowa State defense with John Heacock, who is going to do a lot to try and confuse Cade McNamara, put him under duress, but this is also an Iowa State defense that's a lot more banged up early in the season than most teams want to be, down 2 of their projected starters at linebacker for a game of this magnitude.
Yeah, I mean, Iowa's offense showed a pulse in Tim Lester's debut as the offensive coordinator, and there's a lot of conversation regarding Lester that his scheme is a little more robust and it would take some time to get going. And you know, when I watch it, it's positive because you see more use of motion, right? There's more play action, the things that we like. So inherently the process is substantially better and it's going to yield long-term results. Cade McNamara, I thought, was a positive, not necessarily just his play, but watching him, right? He only had a knee brace on one leg and it was smaller. He just didn't look like the bionic man, and he was willing and confident in running. He stepped into more throws as the game went on. And so for me, that's kind of what I'm looking for when you're playing a little bit lesser of opponent, because that's what's going to translate when you face an Iowa State. You mentioned the true freshman receiver, Reese Vanderzee. He's emerging as wide receiver 1. He's come on all fall camp. Gill has a little juice to him. Luke Lachey is a really solid tight end. And, you know, I think Iowa's pass-catching group might not be as thin as we all projected heading into the season, but I would caution people that think Iowa's offense has been completely fixed overnight. I think this is still a little bit
How dare you? After a 40-point offensive outburst, Iowa fans are screaming from the hilltops that they're going to be the greatest show on turf, making people forget Kurt Warner and Oz Hakeem, along with Isaac Bruce, for what the Rams were able to do back in the day.
Yeah, Torrey Holt. You forgot Torrey Holt.
Fall. We're gonna get to NC State later in the show.
You know, kind of when I watched this, it's like Illinois State's defense just wore down because its offense couldn't sustain drives. 10 of Illinois State's possessions lasted under 2 minutes. There were multiple short fields, right? Iowa's defense created some turnovers. There were some special teams blunders by Illinois State. Iowa also seems to have found the next electric punt returner in Weegent, who created some nice field position for the offense. But, you know, I just kind of watched Illinois State's defense wear down, and that just so happens to be when Iowa's offense really kind of came on. To me, there is a little bit of a battle in this game up front. I was a little disappointed by Iowa's offensive line, and again, it was... You know, I look at this and I was a little disappointed by Iowa State's defensive front in the opener as well. And so that to me kind of is the game within the game here. Iowa's O-line didn't really create push, especially during the first half. If you look at Moulton, Johnson, and Williams, they had 35 carries between them for Iowa. Only 15 of the combined 191 rushing yards came before first contact. So it was Iowa's backs that were dynamite. The O-line necessarily, wasn't. On paper, Iowa State's front seven is supposed to be one of the better in the Big 12. I know Iowa State went extremely vanilla defensively, but it was pretty underwhelming to me against North Dakota. 9% havoc rate created. Running backs averaged 1.7 yards per rush before first contact. You look at North Dakota's quarterback, Simon Rumfo, had 65 yards on 7 carries, and we just talked about Cade McNamara being a little bit more of a willing runner and looking able to actually do it this year without falling apart. The run fits were terrible, and I know you guys mentioned this as the linebacker group's a little bit decimated. Last week, the linebackers alone, 7 missed tackles against North Dakota. Iowa State had 12 as a team, and that's kind of what kept me off Iowa State this week when it leaked across the 3 to 3.5 is injuries to the linebacker group. And Iowa State, you could just tell, missed Carson Willich. He played strong safety last year but was listed as a linebacker. He tore his ACL out for the season coming in, so they were already a little bit banged up. He was Iowa State's second most efficient defender last season. And then you have Caleb Bacon left the North Dakota game with a leg injury. He's out this week. He was Iowa State's most efficient defender last season. Will McLaughlin played over 500 snaps of plus ball last season at linebacker. Didn't play week 1, will be out again this week. And then you have Cale Berzina, who was an impact player in camp at linebacker. He's dinged up, didn't play against North Dakota. So we'll see what his status is. Coming into the season, Iowa State planned to also start Princeton transfer Jalen Travis at left tackle. He's been limited during camp, didn't dress. Starting right tackle Tyler Miller only played 25 snaps against North Dakota. You got your starting tight end Ben Brommer, one of Iowa State's best playmakers last season as a freshman, could only play 16 snaps. He's playing through an injury. So again, I was very much looking to back Iowa State, but someone beat us to the 3.5, and with a total of 35, that 1 point is, through the key of 3 is the size of the ocean. So I don't want 2.5 with all of the injuries I've mentioned, and I'm actually hoping this doesn't get back to 3. So I'm stuck with the debate, and it's starting to trickle there. My hope is to be able to stay off this game, and hearing Brad's thoughts on offense and some of these injuries on defense, I'm probably going to be able to stay off this game.
It's always an interesting game for all the wrong reasons. I'm not sure fireworks are what are in store for this particular contest, but as we mentioned, a total this low, you don't need a whole lot in that department to see this game hover right around that particular number. And you mentioned the battle that we've seen back and forth in terms of the side. We'll see where that price ultimately comes home to roost.
It's also one of those games where every single play becomes magnified because there's not scoring. So it's that one punt return, it's that one turnover that ultimately flips the game on its head, and you're like, is this really what I got involved in?
Hey, there's a lot to be said when one of these teams is chasing a 10-point deficit and you feel like they're down 4 touchdowns midway through the second quarter.
Yes, and hopefully for Brad's case, it's Iowa leading by 10.
Should be a good game. Always fun to set the tone for two teams hailing from power conferences that do battle annually on their opponent's home field. You can follow our talented team on social media. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPowers7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman, but most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already signed up for the Bet the Board podcast newsletter, it's still not too late. NFL Week 1 on the horizon. You'll get all sorts of great information of the pro and college football variety delivered directly to you each and every Friday throughout the fall. Some additional best bet information, some items that you may have missed during your normal handicapping course of study. Just another great tool as we try and make all of you guys and girls smarter handicappers when it comes to football throughout the fall. And some people will oftentimes accuse us, gentlemen, of being Power 5 snobs or Power 4 snobs around these parts, but we do like to delve into parts unknown. And this week, our travels will take us to the sunny metropolis that is Athens, Ohio, for a showdown between South Alabama and the Ohio Bobcats. Ohio now a 2-point dog across the board after opening as a 1-point favorite. We've seen the total leak a little bit from 54 to 56. Brad, South Alabama lost the season opener 52-38 against North Texas, a game where we saw the Mean Green take money off of the 7, and despite it being a first half where they had to come back, they were the dominant team, hanging 28 on this Jaguars defense in that third quarter. Meanwhile, Ohio goes on the road to the JBL Carrier Dome, coming up just short 38-22, but they did display a little bit of pop in the ground game and an ability to get to the edge against Syracuse. When you look at these two teams, one hailing from the Mid-American, one hailing from the Sun Belt, side or total caught your eye for Saturday's showdown?
Yeah, total for me. And even though it's moved a couple of points, I still think there's some value here. We're going over the total over 56. And reason being is, fundamentally different teams. I mean, we'll start with South Alabama with a new coach, an offensive-minded coach, compared to they had a defensive-minded coach the last couple of years, even though Major Applewhite was still there. But they're running more tempo than what they were even a year ago. I mean, number 15 last week. Now, game script said that they had to keep pace with North Texas, but I still, with a new quarterback to run, go from pretty much average in tempo to number 15 in the country in plays per minute last week, I think was noticeable. Obviously, they had success, 582 yards on offense, but the defense was a big-time liability. Lost a lot of their major players, and again, lost a defensive-minded coach and, gave up 50 points and 550 yards to North Texas. So right now, until I see different, South Alabama has an arrow up. I think the more surprising thing is Ohio. You think Ohio the last couple of years, you think, a good, solid defense, low scoring, and the offense just does what they need to do to win, back-to-back 10-win seasons. But last week, they went from being one of the slowest tempo teams in the country last year to, I get it, it's only one game, but they were pretty much average, 70th in the country in plays per minute. And you mentioned it, they found a running back. They had a lot of roster turnover, but they found a guy in the transfer portal from Northwestern that ran for over 200 yards. They got a mobile quarterback. Defense is certainly not nowhere near where it was the last couple of years. They gave up 350 yards passing last week. So I just got up arrows on both teams' offenses, down arrows on both teams' defenses. I got both teams running a lot more tempo than last year, and I got a total that says it's going to be in an average scoring game. I like the over here, over 56.
It's always about some of those hidden gems in the smaller conferences where the market's slow to adjust on if we see a change in personnel, change in pace and tempo, especially early on in the campaign. Payne, wasn't sure if you had anything to add. I know you are a huge fan of Ohio Bobcat football. You live and die with them every single Saturday. So before we move on to Colorado, Nebraska, I did want to at least give you an opportunity.
This is more for our listeners because when Brad and I agree on something and there's an order that's been sent in, I just give the thumbs up, and that was the case here. And I think Brad laid it out perfectly. And specific to South Alabama, a team I'm a little bit more familiar with in the South, one guy returns in their front seven defensively. So just a ton of talent lost there. And what we tracked last week, 14th in plays per minute. So this was an order that came in below the key number of 55, but I agree with Brad. There's still some value here, especially with it being early in the season and odds makers not being able to catch up quite quick enough to these new teams and styles.
From Bobcats and Jaguars to Cornhuskers and Buffalo, Saturday night under the lights at Lincoln Memorial Stadium. It's Nebraska playing host to Colorado, and Nebraska, a full touchdown favorite in this game. Total has leaked up from where it opened as low as that 55.5, 56 threshold, now out to 59. And gentlemen, Colorado seeking their fourth consecutive win over Nebraska for the first time in program history. Their 22-point win was the largest margin of victory for Colorado over Nebraska last year since they beat the Huskers by 26 points going all the way back to 2001. The Buffaloes were on the right side of the turnover ledger in that contest at 4-1. Travis Hunter played 127 snaps in that contest, where Nebraska was able to at least create a little bit of havoc. They got to Shedeur Sanders 8 times, but Nebraska won the ground battle. They just had no answer for a Colorado passing attack that racked up nearly 400 yards through the air. When we look at Deion Sanders, he's now been the head coach at Colorado for 13 games. The underdog in those 13 games, a robust 10-3 against the number. Colorado season opener, most of a national TV audience saw it against North Dakota State. A game that had quite a bit of back and forth. Colorado leaving the door open late with some questionable clock management. NDSU coming up just short with a late game Hail Mary. Meanwhile, Nebraska on the other side hangs 40 points on UTEP. The 40 points were the most under Matt Rule and marked the first 40-point game since a 56-7 win for the Huskers over Northwestern back in 2021. Maybe most impressively for Nebraska, everybody that was on the roster felt like they got out on the field, and maybe even some fans when Nebraska used 108 players in the win over the Miners. Brad, coming into this year, we knew Nebraska's offense could look a little bit different. Dylan Raiola, a massive quarterback recruit, had switched his commitment about 37 times. Plays just one series into the second half, but very impressive workmanlike numbers. 19 of 27, 238 yards through the air. Talked about how he'd been waiting for that opportunity since he was 8 years old. You wouldn't know that after he committed to multiple schools before, but I digress. You look at some of the weapons that emerged for Nebraska. I believe you both talked about Isaiah Nair and what he could could mean as a vertical threat. And they should at least have a path to success against the Colorado defense, who, again, picked up where they left off last year, struggled mightily for stretches against North Dakota State, especially dealing with heavy sets and a little bit of misdirection.
Yeah, so, Nebraska offensively, it's all relative to what Nebraska's offense has been the last few years and also relative to market expectations. And I think there's a little bit of contrast here. Certainly, you have to Nebraska, what you saw offensively compared to what they were. You mentioned it in Matt Rule's first year. Raiola looked the part, at least as good as a true freshman in his first start can look. I wasn't overwhelmed. I'm not, automatically, despite the similarities in appearance and arm angles and throws, I'm not anointing him the next Patrick Mahomes yet. But certainly gives him a lot more than what Nebraska had offensively last year. I'll tell you, if he can just take the snap from center in this particular matchup, it would be a big-time start compared to what Jeff Sims did against Colorado last year. But
you get a turnover. You get a turnover. You get a turnover.
Oh, my God. I still had, that one was tough. I also like what you mentioned, a few of the weapons are around him. Number one, they had three functional running backs that all ran really hard. Emmett Johnson, Dowdell, Ramir Johnson. No game breakers, no alpha, but they have to be licking their chops a little bit this week, it's safe to say, especially an offensive line that I thought got really good push. Again, it's just UTEP, but you had to like what you see there, especially when you can run the football and pound somebody, play action opens up, especially when you have a quarterback now capable of throwing it down the field. And you mentioned Nair, the transfer from Texas and Wyoming, 20 yards per catch. You dive in a little deeper, though. Some of the advanced stats maybe aren't as kind to Nebraska's performance last week. Offensive EPA 88th, success rate 116, EPA drop back 107. And that kind of showed up a little bit on tape when it's a game again. I know you're going to say, Brad, did you watch any games last week? Yeah, I didn't watch it live. There was 100 games last week, and I don't have 100 TVs.
Brad, we know you watch all the FCS games in real time, and you come back on Monday and Tuesday, and that's when you watch the FPS matchups.
Yeah, but
I'd actually be intrigued to watch you watch 100 TVs at once.
5's enough for me, especially if I got multiple plays going.
I'd get anxiety just watching that, I think.
Yeah, people, probably look at me and I'm red faced, and it's something to see. I'll just put it that way.
Hold on, wait 1 second, Brad. Do you get as angry watching games throughout the course of a Saturday as Brian Kelly did in his post game press conference on Sunday night after losing to USC?
It's good. I used to. Not as much now, but there was. In my last place of residence, there was multiple holes in the wall, multiple remote controllers that were busted. There was a hole in a door that got punched through. Yeah, it used to be really bad, to be honest with you. But now, I don't know, I'm getting old. I ain't nobody got time for that. But what I do have time for is to look at a Colorado. And the one game I did watch live was the Colorado-North Dakota State game. And what I saw was much of the same. Colorado defensively. Maybe the run defense a little bit better, but man, North Dakota State, you mentioned the heavy sets, just simple crossing patterns in space, play action, just simple, basic 101 football, and Colorado could not handle it. And so I would worry here, not only at the point of attack, but if Nebraska can get that run game going a little bit, develop some play action with Raiola, got to give the edge to them here. And then I also, as the season wears on, and maybe it's not that big of an issue here because it's just game 2 and they got a couple extra days of rest. We got to watch on Colorado the snap count for Travis Hunter. 129 total snaps, including 72 on defense. I know all of his love gets on the offense side of the ball. I just wonder, defensively, not that, Nebraska's got a bunch of wide receivers that'll test him, but as he gets a little bit tired as the season goes on, it's just something to monitor. One thing I didn't like was, boy, I would make Trevor Woods, the linebacker who used to be a safety for Colorado, make him play in space. He looks like he's pulling sleds. It was one of them early runs North Dakota State had, and he just did not fill the gap, couldn't chase from behind. So provided Raiola can stay turnover free, unlike Jeff Sims, slight edge to Nebraska in this matchup.
You mentioned Travis Hunter, and we know he plays both sides of the ball. And for Colorado, if we have questions about how they performed defensively against North Dakota State, Payne, they answered a lot of them offensively because it was indeed more of the same in a good manner. Shedeur Sanders, most passing yards per game against non-conference opponents since Patrick Mahomes. His 400-yard performance in the opener ended a string of 4 straight games that closed last year where he was banged up and looked pretty pedestrian. Brad mentioned Travis Hunter and that snap count, 7 catches, 132 yards, and 3 touchdowns, yet he wasn't even the team's leading receiver when it came to yardage, a role filled by Jimmy Horn. We talked a little bit this offseason about the FAU transfer, LeJonte Wester, and what he can do to kind of change the dynamic of the offense underneath, and where I think he adds value is with a ground game that still seemed to lack punch. I mean, Dallin Hayden finishes the leading rusher, averaging a robust 2.2 yards per carry, and when we look at Nebraska defensively, I mean, this has kind of always been the calling card for Matt Rule. Tony White talked in press conferences earlier this week about the challenges it's faced and how you look forward to trying to slow down an offense that's this dynamic. And we can look at the numbers where Nebraska has held 8 straight opponents to 24 points or less. They've held 8 straight opponents under 400 yards. But Payne, I dug into the last 8 opponents they've played, and I'm not sure any of those teams can throw a forward pass. I mean, in reverse order, UTEP, Iowa, Wisconsin, Maryland, Michigan State, Purdue, Northwestern, Illinois. This may be a jolt to Nebraska's system under the bright lights in Lincoln on Saturday night.
Yes, I would agree with that. And the talent here is, at least offensively, ridiculous. I mean, Shedeur Sanders is positioning himself to be a top 5 pick, and you mentioned Travis Hunter. We all know what he is. It's LeJonte Wester, a guy that Brad mentioned for multiple seasons now, and Jimmy Horn. I mean, that is what everyone thinks about when you think Colorado football. I agree with that. This specific matchup, though, could be more about Colorado's offensive line. Probably the loudest environment Colorado will be in all season. There's so many new pieces within that group. So can the Buffs O-line hold up and show their improvement on paper is actually legitimate? Game 1, much improved, right? Shedeur held on to the ball for more than 2.9 seconds against North Dakota. And that was longer than last year's average time to throw. And Colorado's offensive line only allowed 5 pressures on 39 dropbacks. So I thought that showed some progression. I would expect a less vanilla defense from Tony White than what he showed against UTEP. But for as good as Nebraska's defensive line is, we had questions about pressure, right? Off the edge. Is there a pure pressure guy here? Nebraska was only able to generate a 25% pressure rate naturally against UTEP. The starting defensive line didn't record a single quarterback hit, and the lone sack came on the final possession with backups in. So that has to change here. You have to get to Shedeur Sanders. I would expect some blitzes. I think disguised pressure is the way because Shedeur does a great job identifying and recognizing pre-snap. But we did see Shedeur relative to other quarterbacks dip in efficiency when he was blitzed last season. Ranked 55th out of 153 qualifiers in passer rating, 48th in adjusted accuracy. Shedeur was top 20 in both areas when he was kept clean. So there was a little bit of a dip there for Shedeur relative to his peers. If Nebraska does have to send more pressure to make Sanders uncomfortable, it's a game where Tommy Hill and Marquise Buford and Malcolm Herzog and Isaiah Guilford will have added pressure on them holding up in coverage. And it does concern me when I've looked at some of their past schedule and offenses they've gone against. Now, it's a really experienced group, all have 3+ seasons at Nebraska, but they all struggled mightily in this matchup a season ago, and there's more weapons and more talent for Colorado's offense this season. I hate to look at one-game samples, but it was tough sledding last year in this matchup. Now, on the season, very solid, both individually and as a unit. All 4 players were above replacement level individually. As a unit, Nebraska secondary was top 30 in scheduled adjusted success rate allowed. So, I'm a little interested to see this matchup. Like, inherently, like if you just look at Nebraska on paper defensively, more of like a physical defense than a speed defense. And Colorado's kind of built the opposite way on offense. So if you can't get pressure, it could have a Nebraska defense that plays a slight touch below expectation. I kind of mentioned the other thing that's somewhat interesting here is the crowd noise and the impact that could have on Colorado. But maybe this is a conspiracist viewpoint, so I'll absolutely blame Brad here. He had me watch the Connor Stallions doc last week, and apparently Memorial Stadium was so loud for the UTEP game, and it'll be even more rowdy this week, that Nebraska's defensive coordinator, Tony White, couldn't communicate with the green dots through helmet comms.
Yep.
So Nebraska relied on hand signals, and Tony wore this neon green long-sleeve shirt so his players could see the hand signals. And it just feels like there's a greater potential for sign stealing if you can't use the helmet comms. And there's some guy there signaling with neon green. That makes me a little more nervous here. But it all comes down to up front. Like, how much improved is this Colorado offensive line? Is Tony going to have to be forced to send blitz to get pressure on Shedeur? Because as good as that defensive front is, it's been the one area of concern, getting natural pressure. There isn't like a true pressure guy here up front.
It's interesting. We talk a little bit about how markets adjust, and this was a game widely available throughout the course of the summer in that 6.5 range. We did see a prominent book open this as low as 5 this week, and the number balloon out to 7.5. We know every half point not created equally, but the move from, or full point, I guess in this case, from 6.5 to 7.5 does change the handicap considerably. Very curious to see where the market consensus that sits at a full touchdown as we record here on a Wednesday morning. Trends typically tipping its hand if we go to 8 across the board or we come down to 6, may indicate who the side to be on come Saturday night ends up being. Saturday night in prime time, we go to Lincoln. Saturday night for your late night, I guess it's Big Ten after dark at this point, and a game where everyone will scramble to try and find it on their various cable providers. You can watch it on Peacock at 10 o'clock Eastern between Boise State and Oregon. And Oregon looking to bounce back after what I think would best be described as a lethargic effort in their opener against Idaho. Boise State, anything but. In a high-scoring affair going on the road, failing to cover, though, as nearly a 2-touchdown favorite in Statesboro against Georgia Southern. You're looking at Oregon right around a 3-touchdown favorite, 19.5, 20, kind of the prevailing price tag. 61 right now in the market. And when we look at the Ducks, 32 straight home wins versus non-conference opponents. It's the it's the longest active streak in all of the FBS. Goes all the way back to 2009 and includes wins over number 18 Utah when they weren't in the same conference 2009, number 7 Michigan State in 2014, and number 12 BYU in 2022. Brad, Oregon's offense. Look, we came into the season thinking that they could put up crooked numbers against everybody. We saw the Alabamas, the Auburns, the Ole Misses of the world hang big numbers on inferior opponents. I know Idaho is a little bit better by FCS standards, but 24-14 won't exactly leave Oregon fans brimming with confidence when they watch that offensive line. Dylan Gabriel, efficient, 41 of 49 for nearly 400 yards passing, 41 completions, a career high, and tied the school record with Danny O'Neal in 1995. But the explosive plays were lacking, and there was nothing that you saw from Oregon that went, you know what, they're going to pick up right where they left off. Now matched up against a Broncos defense, where if I guess there's an antidote to get right, given what we saw from the Broncos secondary in their season opener, this should be a game where Oregon can go nuclear if they do have the potential on the offensive side.
Yeah, obvious out of the way. You got to give a big edge to Oregon here. Boy, that box score for the Idaho game last week was one of the more head scratchers that you've ever seen. I mean, you look at the box score, you thought, well, Oregon should have won this game by 4 touchdowns. But it wasn't like your main culprit, like a bunch of turnovers that prevented them, missed field goals, missed scoring opportunities. They were relatively efficient, particularly, it was kind of a methodical passing attack. I mean, when Gabriel was like 41 out of 49 for nearly 400 yards, certainly functional, but no explosives. Tez Johnson was supposed to be their explosive wide receiver, caught 12 passes for 81 yards. I mean, that's like an Iowa wide receiver for a season stat type of thing, and not in a good way. In the fact that he couldn't get any explosives there. I mean, not much explosives in the run game. So what was the main culprit behind it? And the worry that I would have, not necessarily for this particular game, but if Oregon's going to even come close to meeting preseason expectations, offensive line did not look good, and it wasn't just allowing 3 sacks, but they didn't get much push in the run game. And it was an offensive line that's dealt with some injuries already this offseason. And keep in mind, I mean, you're talking about an offensive line that you mentioned, Todd, before we came on, allowed only 5 sacks all of last season, and yet against an FCS Idaho team who's not a dominant defense at that level, gets 3 sacks on them. Is it Gabriel holding on to the ball too long? I didn't necessarily see that. It was, for guys coming in, free blitzers coming in on the quarterback in a lot of those areas. But the good news is, you mentioned it, they are not playing a great defense by any stretch of the imagination this week in Boise State. Expectations were that this was going to be a much improved defense. That last year's was one of their worst in recent memory as far as school history, but with 10 returning starters and some, I thought some quality coaching hires, including Tyler Stockton from Ball State. If you listen to last year's show, I gave out Ball State a couple times, mainly because of their defense and their defensive scheme under Tyler Stockton, but boy, it didn't pay off in game 1 so far. I mean, as Boise State allowed 45 points and nearly 500 yards to Georgia Southern. Now, I will say, the pass game gave up a few explosives, but they did okay. I mean, Georgia Southern just ran a bunch of plays and overwhelmed them a little bit in that second half. I mean, Georgia Southern only averaged 5.4 yards per play. That's actually a little bit below average nationally. So it was a little hit or miss. I mean, you look at the EPA number 82 last week, below average. You expect it to be worse when you give up that many points. Success rate was 49th. That's actually not shabby, and they have some guys in bits and pieces, like a Simpson at linebacker, an edge. That was one of the best guys in the Mountain West last year. But to me, the worst thing that could happen for Boise State's defense is Oregon only scoring 24 points last week against Idaho. I just imagine that Oregon is locked in for this one. You would hope to see a little bit better offensive line play, and I certainly expect some more explosives, particularly in the pass game in this matchup. So edge to Oregon here.
And that was one of the things, to your point, Brad, that Oregon talked about. They weren't shy about saying they need to get this offense going. They need to hit the explosive. They don't see themselves as a dink and dunk type attack. So you have to imagine they'll do everything they can to scheme up a couple of deep shots, whether it's off RPO or trying to find unique ways to put this Boise State secondary in a little bit of peril on that back end. Now, on the other side of the ball, Payne, I think Oregon acquitted themselves as well as they could defensively, knowing that they didn't get the normal contributions from a couple of their key cogs. You look at what Boise did, though, offensively. We can start there. 651 total yards in their win over Georgia Southern. It was the most since a 2018 game against UConn. They did it all while running 66 plays from scrimmage. Ashton Genty was absolutely outstanding. 20 rushes, a school record 267 yards and 6 touchdowns. His 6 rushing touchdowns tied the Mountain West record with Nevada's Stephon Jefferson back in 2012 and CSU's, or Colorado State's, I should say, Capri Gibbs back in 2013. Nobody rushed for 6 touchdowns in the entire FBS schedule last season. His first touchdown also a 77-yard run, the longest of his career. But when we look at Boise from a quarterback standpoint, Maddox Madsen, not the kind of guy that strikes fear in the hearts of a lot of Power 4 defenses, and you have to imagine that Oregon dealing with some injury concerns for star linebackers Jeffrey Bassa and Justin Jacobs. I mean, that tandem played a combined 17 snaps versus Idaho. If with a full workload on deck, this will be an Oregon defense that can cause some problems if they make Boise one-dimensional.
Yeah, I think everything you said there pretty much is the overarching view from my perspective, and it's what we all witnessed last week, and it's be the least surprising thing said on a sports show heading into week 2. Oregon has to keep Ashton Genty in check and actually make him work for his yards. Force Genty to be an accumulator and not the efficiency monster he was last week. And if you just single out that performance, Genty was accumulated the 9th most total EPA by a college running back in a game ever. And Boise doesn't escape the South without a loss, if not for Genty. And I thought Boise's offensive line was solid. We knew coming into the year that was part of the reason we were buying was Genty in the offensive line, which returns 4 or 5 starters, 2 all-conference players, and Casey and Dooley side by side on the left. Oregon's defensive line is interesting because it's a group that has some variance to it. They lost Dorless, obviously, and he wasn't necessarily a total scheme fit, but he was really good for them. Dan Lanning's done a fantastic job recruiting the high school level while making some key portal additions, and you just wonder if it can all come together simultaneously, right? Are the portal guys as good as we think? Can they get familiar with the system quick enough while the young talent actually grows and contributes in maybe a depth area? And that'd be the perfect combination. Idaho didn't really try to run the ball against Oregon. 11 attempts in total from running backs, but the concern was on those 11 running back runs, Oregon allowed Idaho to gain 2.9 yards before first contact. And so, Derek Harmon, the seven-figure transfer tackle up front. You have, Jamari Caldwell, the Houston transfer that was a number slightly less than that. And then Jordan Birch, the South Carolina transfer from last year. That trio has to hold up at the point of attack this week to remove Genty from the game. The positive here is everything you outlined, Todd. It appears the Ducks are getting healthier in the back to where if Tosh Loophole needs to add an extra guy in the box, he can. Oregon played their two starting linebackers, you mentioned, Bossa and Jacobs, 17 combined snaps together against Idaho. That was interesting to me. Now, they were a little dinged up in fall camp, and then you have Oregon's projected starting field corner, Cam Alexander, didn't play against Idaho. He's back at practice this week and ready to go, and Cam's been really solid the last two seasons at Sam Houston and UTSA, 5.7 yards per target allowed. So you get Cam back, you pair him with Jabbar Muhammad. Dante Manning, also a really nice corner, so that's a good trio there. So if Oregon is forced to put more guys in the box to stop Genty, that trio becomes really important in stopping Cam Camper, a guy I know Brad has talked about and kind of hinted at that Boise pass-catching group being a little bit better than we all expected. Cam Camper, wildly talented receiver that transferred in from Indiana. He's dealt with horrific quarterback play there for 2 seasons, still averaged over 2 yards per route run. Boise did a very nice job offensively moving Camper around. 32% of his snaps were in the slot, 68% outside. Camper averaged nearly 5 yards per route run in that opener. Oregon, certainly the first real test on defense this week, and probably their only test until Ohio State comes to town in the middle of October. So if you've listened to Dan Lanning, he's kind of been hyping this Boise game up internally for a long time, making it bigger than it probably is to its players to get them focused and prepared for, a large moment that they're going to have similar, against the Buckeyes. I think Oregon's defense passes the test this week. And maybe one X factor here, and there isn't much data on this, and it's really early in the season when fatigue shouldn't be as large of a factor, and Boise should have been able to map out what they deemed probably the best game plan all off season. But Boise, obviously, Mountain West team, Mountain Standard Time Zone. They traveled to the Deep South in extreme humidity to play a bizarre road game in Georgia last week, Eastern Time Zone. Boise travels back. They're not going to have as much practice time, but they're going to be practicing Mountain Time Zone this week. And then I know the travel's short to Oregon, but it's a Pacific time zone. That's 3 time zones in 6 days, one where Boise dealt with extreme humidity. So I'm a little interested to see where this game ultimately goes from here. It wouldn't be overly surprising to see this leak across the 20 at some point. I know when Dan Lanning kind of makes these statements internally, as we saw last year against Colorado, he usually is able to get the team up. But I think, my largest concern is actually one that Brad mentioned, and it's the offensive side of the ball. We were not as high in our preview on Oregon's offensive line. Jackson Powers Johnson was a massive loss. They're dealing with some injuries. We're all hoping that Oregon can push the ball downfield, but the reality is some of that pressure allowed last week came on Dylan Johnson getting rid of the ball in 2.1 seconds. So if you can't protect him, how can you push it downfield and use some of that explosiveness, which is obviously vital when you're trying to cover nearly 3 scores here.
Yeah, an interesting nightcap to see, to a point you guys highlighted, how Boise stacks up against some of the big boys. I don't think they have to win this game to help improve their resume to be the G5 entrant into the college football playoff, but clearly don't want to be on the wrong side of a 56-19 decision like they were in their season opener last year against Washington. And no doubt Oregon would like to build a little bit more confidence before going into the Civil War next week. Granted, a game that doesn't mean nearly as much, but still important for in-state bragging rights before they'll kick off Big Ten play in late September on the road at the Rose Bowl against UCLA. And I know a lot of our listeners sitting here going through the schedule in their head going, what the hell is going on here? You guys haven't covered one of the biggest games on the slate. Well, you guys can blame the folks that come up with the rotation order. Have no idea why we moved NC State, Tennessee from where it was normally supposed to be in the rotation schedule further down into a write-in added category. But rest assured, especially to one former SEC Conference Player of the Year on the hardwood for Tennessee, we weren't going to ignore the Volunteers when they play NC State on a neutral field in Charlotte Saturday night. And this is a game where we've seen the number get much bigger at this point through the key number, given the results during week 1. Tennessee now a 7.5-point favorite in Charlotte, taking on the Wolfpack. Total in this game, 59.5, kind of where it opened, out to 61. And when you look at Tennessee, they obliterated UT Chattanooga. NC State, meanwhile, needed a fourth-quarter rally to outlast Western Carolina. Both FCS opponents. Pretty good, relatively speaking, by FCS standards, but clearly a different metric that we saw from both of those teams. You look at Grayson McCall, struggled a bit in the first half trying to hit open receivers in his NC State debut. The same couldn't be further from the truth for Nico, who settled right into the starting quarterback role and was slicing and dicing that mock secondary. And Brad, when we look at the 69-point outburst in the season opener for Tennessee, it was the second most they've scored in the modern era, most since Josh Heupel took over, 700+ yards. I mean, Nico hitting the middle of the field. And what I thought resonated the most, we haven't exactly been leaders or proponents of the Joe Milton fan club, but Josh Heupel more or less insinuating that the offense can operate the way it needs to, attacking the middle of the field with Nico, something that they weren't able to do with Joe Milton as their starting quarterback last year.
Yeah, and that offense looked very similar to the 2022 Tennessee offense as far as getting the team spread out appropriately and really pushing the ball down the field. I got to say, of the 10 teams we talked about today, at least on tape, I thought Tennessee was the most impressive, both offensively and defensively, the havoc, the explosives, you name it. And just to put in perspective, when you're comparing their performance against Chattanooga and NC State's performance against Western Carolina, both those teams are top 25 FCS teams, and both, when you're talking about a power rating, they're within a field goal of one another. So very similar power rated teams, and stark difference in result last week. You mentioned, Iamaleava played a half, threw for 300 yards, completed almost 80%, 11.2 yards per attempt. Looks the part. Obviously looks a lot more efficient than Joe Milton a year ago. It wasn't just him, though. I know he's getting all the headlines. Dylan Sampson has to be the workhorse this year at running back. They had 3 functional running backs last year. Well, Sampson has to carry more of the load this year. First test passed and then some, 3 touchdowns, 10.3 yards per carry. I think PFF graded him as the number 4 running back performance last week, so that gets a big thumbs up. You look at the wide receiver position, weren't healthy last year, specifically Brew McCoy and Dante Thornton. They looked healthy, at least last week. They had nearly combined 200 yards receiving between the two of them. Speaking of health, Cooper Mays has not always been healthy. The transfer for them at center, when he's healthy, Tennessee is a more functional offensive line, and they're a more functional offense. Certainly, he's in the lineup last week, and you saw what could be the best, one of the best offenses in the country this year. So I really liked what I saw from Tennessee's offense, to say the least.
When you look,
not necessarily.
Oh, go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
No, when you look at it,
go ahead.
I was going to say against NC State defensively, this is a group with Tony Gibson who likes to do some unique things. And when you go through that stop unit player for player, do you think they're able to do enough to confuse a young quarterback? But I think what was interesting when you read some of the recaps coming out of the Chattanooga game, people kept talking about, this is Nico's debut. How quickly they forget. This was a quarterback who was thrown feet into the fire. I know a bowl game and a little different dynamic, but playing Iowa isn't exactly a soft landing spot for a quarterback in any capacity, even in a one-off bowl game setting.
You bring up a great point. He already saw what he needed to see against Iowa's defense in the bowl game and passed that one. It wasn't overwhelming. They got some short fields as far as the 35 points, but he did what he needed to do in that one. Mention quarterback. I'll mention quarterback of the defense and the guy that isn't there for NC State. And I got to tell you, it's been noticeable. Showed up in the bowl game against Kansas State and even showed up last week. And a guy that would have been perfect to at least try to compensate for this Tennessee offense. I'm not sure there's many better linebackers in the country that could have handled it. Peyton Wilson. Obviously, he's not there for NC State. You're talking about a guy that can run sideline to sideline, 4-4, leader of the NC State defense for the last several years. Not there. And, man, as good as I think Tony Gibson is, and I think at minimal, a top 20 defensive coordinator in the country, maybe even top 10, and I do like some of their bits and pieces, and the Van kid, the Aiden White kid in the secondary, I just do not see a pathway to much success here with Tennessee functioning at a high level when they're spreading you out and they got weapons all over the field and they're healthy and you got a quarterback that can not only throw the ball down the field but throw it accurately down the field. I don't see it. I mean, I thought they were okay the last week, particularly when they needed to be late in the game against Western Carolina, but I still saw open receivers. I still saw Western Carolina spread them around and had a creative offensive game plan, and Western Carolina is one of the better FCS offenses, but you got to give the edge here to Tennessee and then some.
I do love when you read about these teams that don't always play these high-octane, fast-tempo offenses and what they have to do from a scouting standpoint and to kind of build up their game plan. I know Tony Gibson comes from a little bit of a Big 12 background, so has some familiarity, but reading the comments talking about how NC State has basically played two different offensive groups to try and simulate the speed that Tennessee is going to go with. Rather than having just their first-team offense try and replicate that breakneck pace, they run two huddles on the field at the same time to try and keep this defense ready. We know when live bullets start flying, it can be a little bit of a different dynamic. And Payne, when we look at NC State, so much when we talk about Tennessee football in general is about, can you slow down the offense? I'll play devil's advocate and say the best way to slow down Tennessee's offense is being able to match them score for score. So if you get a quick 3 and out, you can force the Vols to play from behind. Well, maybe NC State found its footing in that fourth quarter where 40% of the Wolfpack's offensive output came at a key juncture in the game when they needed it most. They did break a dubious distinction, having gone 33 straight regular season games without a 100-yard rusher before Jordan Waters finished the game with 123 yards. They were the only team in the FBS without a 100-yard rusher in either of the last 2 regular seasons. KC Concepcion is outstanding as a receiver, but they're going to need other players to step up. When we look at Tennessee defensively, you guys talked about it. Very good defensive line, but a lot of questions in the linebacking room and in the secondary. Does NC State have the kind of playmakers and scheme offensively to test Tennessee?
That's the big question, and that's why there's serious variance to this side of the ball, and I'm sure people are looking for a more definitive statement in a big matchup game like this for week 2, but I really am not 100% certain on what we're going to see. Timing and rhythm-wise, everything just felt a half tick off for NC State's offense, and I think that's to be expected with so many new parts. And I think as we get more data points on transfers, it's possible we realize early on that we have to temper our projections unless the quarterback or incoming talent is just so undeniable. But I liken this to the NFL, where we talk all the time about these NFL offenses going through dramatic change, scheme changes, quarterback change, and how it takes an offseason plus 8 games or so of the regular season to get acclimated, and those are guys that are doing this as their main job, right? And so you kind of wonder there. NC State's offense to me is mostly new, right? New quarterback in Grayson McCall, Waters and Smothers transferring at running back from Duke and Oklahoma, new weapons with Jolie and Rogers. Offensive line returns 4, but that was the one area where, I watched this game twice now. They didn't get much push against Western Carolina the first 2 quarters. Negative EPA per rush in the first half. This was a Wolfpack O-line group that was barely inside the top 100 in offensive line yards created last season. It really wasn't until the final drive that Waters got going. His first 17 carries went for 3.5 yards a pop. when I watched Grayson McCall, I saw some similar things to you, Todd. He wasn't overly accurate, and you could see Western Carolina daring McCall to push the ball downfield. They were walking their safeties up. They were playing tight coverage. McCall was 2 for 6 with a turnover-worthy throw on passes 20-plus yards. I don't know if this can be cleaned up in a week. Tennessee's defensive data point was, to me, unreal. Net positive for the game, 36% success rate versus Chattanooga. Garbage time hit in the second quarter. The Vols' defensive line was dominant and rotated guys, so I would expect them to be completely fresh in this spot. I don't really anticipate NC State being able to run efficiently here. The Vols return virtually everyone up front except Barron on the edge. Tyree West, though, has taken that next step. We saw it in the bowl game. He had a monster fall camp. He just could not be blocked last week. And this was a Vols defense that finished top 15 in line yards allowed last season, created tons of havoc. And so for me, I would expect the same thing here. So it becomes a game that's really in Grayson McCall's hands. And that's, the first part of the variance. The second part is, if you had a game plan to attack this version of Tennessee coming into the season, it's absolutely through the air. And because there's question marks in that Vols secondary, it's a group that finished outside the top 90 in EPA per pass allowed last season, could not stop the explosive. All the parts are virtually new, but there's so many new pieces with transfers that you worry some about the cohesion. So I don't have a great feel for this side of the ball, because it wouldn't shock me if NC State was suddenly in rhythm with the new pieces getting acclimated and taking advantage of an area that we thought for Tennessee's defense was a little vulnerable coming into the year, and seeing them potentially get exposed. But I think what's interesting here is, we talk all the time about not overreacting to singular data points, but Brad made a very good point in that both these teams' opponents last week are very similarly rated on the FCS scale. But in saying that, we're now... I don't know what type of adjustments you made, Brad, but last week this would have been more of like a 5.5 point game for us.
Yep.
And now we're... as we're recording this, there's some spots trending to 9. And so very similar to the Iowa game. I'm not sure I want to see a 10 here, but I would probably be forced to get involved if that were to somehow shape up happening here.
Yeah, Payne, you took us right where I wanted to go to Brad. So, Brad, we'll give you final word in terms of what kind of adjustments here that you see. To Payne's point, 5.5 was actually where it opened during the summer. We saw money come in on the dog that it trended towards 4.5, and here we are through that key number of 7, and that's 7.5 in no man's land, but not knowing exactly where the next stop will be.
So I bet Tennessee's win total under 9.5. I'm already kind of scared on that one. That's what I saw. That's how impressed I was on tape. And I bet NC State's win total over. So I was maybe a little bit more aggressive with my adjustments. Tennessee up a 1.5. NC State down 1.5. I was closer to 6 though last week. So do the third grade math. I got it at 9. So I think 9's a pretty good number. But I would agree it'd have to be dog if it got out to 10.
Always interesting to see these games early on in the season, and it's a Week 2 slate that doesn't offer a ton of marquee matchups, but still plenty of opportunity to learn about some of these teams before they get into the heart, or meat and potatoes, I should say, of their conference schedule. You, of course, can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman, but most importantly, for all things Bet the Board, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. 5 games broken down as in-depth as we know how to do around the home office in these parts. Sometimes your schedule gives you all sorts of opportunity and upside, like Week 1. Week 2, you got to grind a little bit more to try and find some of those marquee games from a viewership standpoint. So we've gotten to the portion of the program where we try and build on last week's momentum with an actionable element for the best bet. Mr. Payne, what have we identified this week, kind sir?
I'm going to actually put this on you a little bit because, we kind of have these conversations behind the scenes frequently. And as we record these on Wednesdays, it's difficult because you've missed the best number possible, getting out in front. And then there's some maneuvering as the bigger stuff is going to come in on, late Thursday, Friday evening. And so it creates a little bit of a dynamic. There's some weather in play this week as well. So one that we have discussed, and it's pretty ugly, but the line is still there, where we find a little bit of value there is with the Virginia Cavaliers, which is going to probably surprise some folks. Virginia plus 2.5. They're at Wake Forest. Just from a power ratings perspective, we're showing a little bit of value here. But I think, things that you and I have discussed is where these programs are potentially at in the current moment, with Wake Forest continuing to trickle down a little bit.
It kills me to say that, too, because we are Team Dave Clawson around these parts, but the current landscape of college football just doesn't allow for a program that small to compete.
And it just seems like Clawson was really defeated at certain points last season. They're having some issues offensively. For as much as we bagged on Tony Elliott, it seems like Virginia's written the ship just a little bit. We've seen some game efforts from them late last season on the road, obviously going to North Carolina, winning that game outright. I know Miami was a little bit of a mess, but were really competitive in that game as well. I thought from a week one perspective, that continued to trend in both directions. We saw Wake Forest kind of unsettled at the quarterback position, to say the least. So found some value in 3-6-3 Virginia plus 2.5. We're kind of working on this game a little bit, trying to get a 3. The market is not cooperated and seems kind of privy to our attempt there. So would have much preferred it there at 3, but I know you prefer this game from a couple of the ones that we've discussed. What's kind of catching your eye here with Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. Early in the season, we know these markets are volatile. A couple of the other possibilities have moved, not necessarily across key numbers, but we don't want to have people chasing some of what's out there in the market. So that makes the process, I don't want to say more straightforward, but I guess a little bit more streamlined compared to later in the year where we don't see some of those massive swings. But I look at this Virginia team offensively, and I actually like some of the changes that they made down the stretch. They committed to a starting quarterback that I think, in my opinion, offers some upside. He's a little bit of a gunslinger, and Anthony Calandria, and what he can bring to the table. But you see some of that passing acumen. You see his ability just to extend plays with his legs. They have a back in Kobe Pace, who I think flies a little under the radar, the former Clemson transfer, and some unheralded weapons at receiver. So while normally this would be deemed a coaching mismatch with Dave Clawson up against Tony Elliott, I think it's hard to ignore the trajectory, to your point, of these programs and what they have on the field. And look, any college football fan has lived through the Hank Bachmeier experience. I'm not sure he's necessarily going to be the starter this week, but when you look at the snap share last week, took over for Michael Kern. I'm shocked, to be honest, that it was that much of a battle coming into the season, that Kern acquitted himself so well after watching him last year. So I think this is a game where it wouldn't shock me at all if we saw the number trend continue to trend in Virginia's direction. There's a reason that we weren't able to get to the key at +3 with the dog.
Beautiful. All right, let's wrap this thing up.
All right, college football, week 2 in the books. We'll be back week 1 of the NFL season, Thursday night, Friday night, Sunday night, Monday night football. Plenty of great information and content, 24-hour respite from us, and we'll be back with all of the big games. Most importantly, a special thanks to Brad Powers, always stepping in on these college shows on a Wednesday. Those non-powers 4 is what we should be calling them at this point. Best bets have been phenomenal since Brad has joined our show. And of course, as always, best of luck with all of your investments. And most importantly, with a UVA ticket in hand, come Saturday evening, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.